Hey, everybody, this is Gene Martz, and welcome back to another episode of BizBooks, where we talk to great business authors about the great business books that they have written. My guest today is Matt Watkinson. Matt is the author of The Grid, the decision-making tool for every business, including yours. Matt, first of all, thanks very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks, Gene.
Yeah, I'm glad that you are here. Matt's website is matt-watkinson.com. Matt, first of all, let's just get a little background on you and how you came to write this book. Tell us about yourself.
Well, The Grid is my second book, which followed on from the first book, which was called The 10 Principles Behind Great Customer Experiences. And my background was in designing websites, software, apps, that kind of thing. That's what I did for the first 10 or so years of my career. And over time, as that industry evolved, the challenge became joining all of those different channels and touch points together into a kind of more cohesive and coherent customer experience, which is what I found myself doing and what I wrote my first book on, this book of customer experience principles. But when that book came out, it kind of changed the nature of the work that I was approached to do by clients. They didn't really see me as a doer anymore, somebody who could like roll up their sleeves and actually design something. They saw me on a more kind of strategic plane. And one thing that became almost immediately apparent when that change happened was that a lot of people were knee-jerking or assuming that the kind of customer experience was the problem without really doing any kind of structured analysis. And what I thought was needed was a way for people to see, ideally on a single page, all of the factors that determined whether their business, all of the factors that contributed, should we say, to the success of their business in one place, that would then allow them to have much more structured conversations or much more clear-headed analysis about where to invest their limited resources to best achieve their objectives, right? So, I mean, you can spend all the money you want on customer experience improvements, but if the problem is that nobody knows you exist, it's a waste of money, right? You can spend all the money you want on advertising, but if the product is simply non-competitive and isn't going to meet people's needs, again, it's a waste of money. So what I was looking to do in creating the grid first and foremost was give people a means of seeing in a single place all of these factors that might determine their success, and so be able to prioritize where they focus their efforts in order to help their business grow or succeed. And a side effect of doing that was that actually a few other use cases emerged that have proven to be extremely successful. So or extremely helpful rather. So you can in a sense use the grid to identify the specific strengths and weaknesses of your business, kind of like a super SWOT analysis, if people are familiar with that, with that framework. But you can also use it for in two other really valuable use cases. One is if you're launching an entirely new venture or product line, you can work through all the elements of the grid and make sure that you've at least considered them. Some of them will be unknowns because there's a lot of risk and uncertainty in entrepreneurship, of course. And then also if you're maybe a larger organization and you're considering embarking on a project, you can use it to overcome this challenge that a lot of organizations have, which is that we're kind of in a silo. So you can use the grid as a means to consider the broader implications of a decision beyond your or project beyond your immediate department. So you could say, okay, if we're doing this cost-cutting initiative, for example, how might that affect our brand? Or how might that affect our imitability? Like if we outsource something, some low-cost partner, and all of our rivals of Outcore have done the same thing. That might make us more similar to everybody else, which actually might undermine our long-term prospects. So it gives you this, we call it a mental scaffolding for thinking through the decisions that you want to make, large or small, and considering the broader ramifications of them.
For those of you guys that haven't watched, haven't read this book yet, what Matt's referring to is, is a grid. There are 9 boxes that are headed up by, desirability, profitability, longevity, and then where these boxes, identify, both customers, the market, your organization. It's like all in one place. And although, Matt, you've simplified it into sort of like this Jeopardy looking formats, it's actually quite complex. I mean, you dig in, quite deeply to some of the concepts. Before we dig into just a few of them, because I don't want to give it all away, how'd you come up with this? Like, where did this all come from?
Yeah, well, there's it actually began with some events in my personal life. I was having some difficulty with knee pain actually, and I'd been to all sorts of different people to get help with that: osteopaths, physical therapists,
Okay.
massage, I mean, you name it, and nothing worked. I had surgery actually on both my knees, and that didn't work either.
Right.
And then I did end up seeing a physical therapist who was kind of a cut above all of these other clowns, who did a much more structured analysis of the problem and traced it back to these muscle imbalances in my hips and glutes and lower back and that kind of area, which was kind of pulling the muscles on the outside of the leg and putting tension on the outside of the knee, which was causing the pain. Now, the difference between her and everybody else is that everybody else was looking at the knee which hurt and trying to figure out what the problem was, whereas she was looking at the body as an integrated system and identifying what the root cause of the problem was, so that it could be tackled to maximum effect. There's this saying in anatomy that it's the victim that screams, not the perpetrator. So where you often feel the pain is where is not actually the source of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I was intrigued by her approach because it was very analogous to what we often experience in the workplace, right? Like, people don't tend to think in systems. They actually tend to think in a very reductionist way, looking at each part of the business individually without necessarily considering how that might ladder up to a catastrophe or unanticipated second order effects. So you see this all the time in business. The genesis of most major scandals or catastrophes is a fixation on one element of the system at the expense of the others. So, to just give a couple of real world examples to that. If you look at this crisis that happened with Wells Fargo a number of years ago, where the CEO was insistent that customers should have 8 Wells Fargo products, whether they really wanted them or not. What you're basically doing there is you're saying, well, we're going to fixate on sales volume at the expense of meeting our
wants and needs,
regulatory obligations.
Right.
Firstly, and regulation is on the grid, and at the expense of our brand, and at the expense of our customer experience, and frankly, at the expense of a massive fixed cost when the fines come in.
Yeah, true.
And the constraints come in. So, these are all these are all things that are on the grid: customer experience, brand, fixed costs, regulation. So what they might have done if they were smart is they might have said, well, hang on, if we do that, if we insist that every customer has 8 products and we just create a load of fraudulent accounts, whether it makes sense or not, then how is that going to spread its tentacles across the rest of the grid? And they would very clearly have realized that this was a terrible decision to make. If we go back even further to the 90s, I think it was, Hoover, the vacuum cleaner company, ran a promotion where if you paid over £100, if you bought over £100 of Hoover
Yeah.
crap, like
Yeah.
toasters or whatever it is,
Yeah.
you would get 2 return flights to New York from
Right.
London.
Right.
You just look at that and you'd say, well,
It almost bankrupted the company.
it did bankrupt the company,
Yeah.
and all of these senior executives lost their jobs over it. So, like, you look at that and you go, well, okay, this is going to generate a lot of sales. Again, fixation on volume, but with a totally impossible variable cost associated with it, and the immolation of our cash reserves, cash being another element of the grid, and the destruction of our reputation in the process. So, what you're seeing with any of these things, you could talk about the Volkswagen emissions thing. You could talk about Mylan gouging people for the EpiPen. You could look at any of these catastrophes or problems that we have in the business world, and not all of them make the headlines, but most companies have them at some point. And what you can ultimately trace it back to is a lack of consideration for second order effects of decision making.
Yeah.
Or a
In
lack
other words,
thinking.
not considering the whole, right? I mean, just being too focused on specifics.
And the whole point of the grid was to give people a way to have specialists from different disciplines having a kind of lingua franca or common reference point for considering the broader implications of their decisions, which is a major problem in organizations, large or small, and also to identify what their true constraints to performance are, so that they could focus on them.
Okay, so and we're gonna dig into some of the concepts of the specific concepts of the grid itself, because I had some questions for you on it. But my big question I have for you is, before we even talk about that, is when, Matt, should we be pulling the grid out? I mean, there are a lot of decisions in a business. I mean, anything from where should our holiday party be, to whether or not we should hire this person to be our controller, to whether or not we should have a sales promotion that gives away 2 free round trip tickets, so if I'm running a business, if I'm a CEO or I'm a senior manager and I want to refer to the grid because I want some help in making this, what types of decisions would you say the grid is really best for?
So, well, there's a couple of different ways of answering that. I think actually probably the most effective way of using the grid in my experience or opinion is not to necessarily print off the worksheets. We have those, or use the digital tools, which are free, and we have those too. And the first few times, you should use those and get familiar with them. But where I find the biggest value of the grid comes is when people just are aware of the structure in their mind, and it's kind of embedded in their brain in some way, and it just makes them think for a second. Hang on. Have we thought about the implications of this decision on that? So rather than making it kind of onerous box ticking exercise, it's more that it becomes a mental structure that you naturally start to apply, or that it facilitates conversation. Okay. And when you write a book, you'll come up with an idea like this. You really don't know how people are going to use it, whether people are going to like it, whether they're going to hate it. what context they'll end up using it in. And the grid, one of the things that I guess surprised me about the grid was that it's actually been more useful as a communication tool and a decision-making tool, if that makes sense.
It does.
So in my own company, we use the labels of the items in the grid in everyday conversation amongst the management team when we're making decisions. We don't really often sit down and print it out and go through it because we're so used to that structure, but we reference pardon me, we reference all of the elements of the grid in our daily business conversations. And when we talk about what we're doing strategically, anyone in the business can overlay what we're talking about over this kind of mental model and see why we're doing why we're doing what we're doing. And in fact, one of the things that I've kind of realized as a consequence of that is that most of what gets sold as strategy, or most of what gets done as strategy, is kind of needlessly complex. Like in our own business, for example, we're very focused just on a couple of elements of the grid that have been our priority area for 3 years and will probably continue to be our priority area for the next 3 years, which is expanding our customer base by acquiring more customers.
Sure.
Because that's how you grow an agency business and minimize your risk profile. Right? It's by having a broader base of customers. So what are we focused on? Well, we're focused on acquiring customers. That's pretty much it.
Sure.
That's the end of our strategy conversation.
Sure. It seems to me like, the grid itself is less of a blueprint and more of a culture that you adapt in your country, in your company, that it's just, it gives you a framework for making decisions, that everybody can be involved in and communicating those decisions. That was my biggest takeaway from this. Let's go down into some of the specifics though, and I'll jump around a little bit, but when you start digging into some of the details of the grid, you talk about a guy named M. Biver, who him and a partner bought rights to Blancpain for like $15,000, a watchmaker, right? Sold it for $43 million 10 years later. And then he also had some other successes in the industry as well, phenomenal successes in the industry. And he, in your opinion, he is somebody that really understood the wants and needs of customers. And you said if your offering I'm reading this, if your offering can reflect the customer's values and social group, it can give it a magnetic appeal. So talk to us about wants and needs and how important that is as it relates to all the other specific things you should be considering on the grid.
Okay, so for context, the grid has three columns that are the outcomes that every organization is aiming for. Desirability: if people don't want what we're selling, we've got a fundamental problem. That's column one. Profitability: if it costs us more to sell our stuff than we can charge for it, eventually we'll run out of cash. So that would be profitability. Then the third column is longevity. The longer we're making that profit for, the better, right? So those are the three columns. Well, when we talk about desirability, that first column, what's the foundation of desirability? The foundation of desirability is that people either want or need the thing that we're selling.
Yep.
Right. So desirability actually emerges from the interplay of three things. It's the wants and needs that the customer has, the extent to which they are catered for by alternatives, so rivalry, and then the extent to which we are able to satisfy those wants and needs with our own offering. So, for example, you might find that customers' wants and needs stay the same, our product stays the same, and a rival does it better, in which case our desirability goes down. You might see that wants and needs stay the same, our product stays the same, and our rivals get embroiled in some silly scandal or have some supply chain issue, in which case our desirability goes up without us doing anything.
Hmm.
You might find that the customer's wants and needs change and we respond better than our rivals to that. And desirability goes up. We might even have a situation where we lead the customer. We don't ask them what they want or what they need. We take the risk to create something, some kind of visionary or extremely innovative product or service that then creates a want or need in the customer's mind, and they then find that product or service highly desirable. In fact, you could argue that that's actually the best way of doing it. You take the risk, and you lead the customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
You innovate on behalf of the customer, as Jeff Bezos, I think called it. But the foundation ultimately is, what does the customer want and need? And there are various aspects to that. You can get into a whole ton of detail about what they may or may not want or need. But I think it's a truism that, and I'm sure this is a quote that I've liberated from somebody, but for the life of me, I can't remember who it is. People put their money where their aspirations are,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding identity, understanding people's self-conception, understanding people's individual aspirations can obviously be a route to creating a really valuable brand and products that have a lot of appeal for people. You see this all the time, that people put money where their aspirations are. People also buy things that are highly functional that they just need.
Sure.
People
Sure.
also buy highly functional things that they need but don't want. Like accountancy, or things like that. The other aspect of that wants and needs box that I think is often massively overlooked is the adoption barriers piece, which is that sometimes people can want a product or service, but there are insurmountable barriers to them
right
being able to buy or use it. Either it's training, or it's the upfront cost, or there's some other kind of challenge with it. And one of the things that has actually been most valuable in the grid is the model, the sub-model in that chapter that goes into what those different adoption barriers are. Because I don't think we've ever had a client who's thought through those in any kind of systematic manner. And they carry huge implications for businesses large and small. I think the example that I use in the grid is talking about the massive Airbus, the A380, which is an amazing airplane, but you can't land it anywhere.
Right.
Or the cost of adapting airports to take that airplane was, into the hundreds of millions. Right. And there are only some routes where it makes sense. So obviously the adoption barriers for buying an A380 Airbus are much higher than for buying a Dreamliner. And Airbus, freely admit that they will never ever make back the investment in the A380, and it's been discontinued, as I understand it. So that's basically, you can boil it all down. You can boil their problem down to adoption barriers. So should they have thought about adoption barriers? I'm sure they probably did.
Right.
And it's probably a bit flippant for me to say, well, they should have just looked at that. But again, you see that almost every business problem tracks back to one of these very, very simple factors on the grid, which is what makes it immensely useful as a decision-making tool.
I'll move on to some other areas of the grid, but before we leave wants and needs, it's the first one you start with. It's in the upper left-hand corner. It's really the core beginning of everything else that you're going to apply on the grid. So, it's one thing to say you have to establish what wants and needs are. Most of my clients, and I'm sure most of your clients, have got to be asking you like, well, how do we do that? How do we establish what those wants and needs are? Where do we go? And what do you say to them when people ask you that question? It's not just something you pull out of your head. There's got to be some research involved, or some exercise involved to figure out what those wants and needs are. What I'm just curious to hear if you have any advice on that.
I've got a lot of thoughts on that particular topic, and they've changed. They've changed quite significantly over the last few years. I have a new book that's coming out next year that actually explains all of this stuff. But
okay, I'd like to hear some of it.
Well, I'm just trying to think how to address the topic without going down
A rabbit hole.
A massive rabbit hole. The way that you discover what people want or need is to make something and see whether they buy it.
Okay. Okay.
It's really as simple as that. Or you start selling the product before you've even made it to see whether people want to buy it. Right? Like, I think the world, so there is a lot that is not understood in the business world about risk and uncertainty. And if you're trying to innovate, or you're trying to create a new product that is exciting, or you're trying to create something that is going to change the course of a market, you know, you can pick any number of products that have done that, and you can pick any number of companies that aspire to do that. You are confronting massive uncertainty, right?
Right.
And that uncertainty cannot be analyzed out.
Right. Right. There's no way to determine it.
There's no way to analyze out the massive uncertainties involved in entrepreneurship. The only way to do it is to build something, a prototype,
right?
You know, or go off and try and sell the idea to people and see what they say.
It's a great, first of all, I'll stop you right there, because again, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but that it's great advice. And it's simplistic and it makes so much sense. I mean, you know, how many startups do you meet that come up with this great idea and it's still just a complete crapshoot as to whether or not it's filling any wants or needs out there until it actually happens. And, you know, some of my more successful clients, when they come up with new product lines, or, you know, they decide to offer new types of services, they usually do it on a test basis, pilot programs, prototypes, like you said, to really see, because, you know, we behave like we're in a bubble. And sometimes we don't, you know, we think this is a great idea, but until the market actually shows us whether or not it is, we don't know until we're putting up some example. So,
Gene, I could make the same argument in an even more pointed or blunt fashion for you, actually. Perhaps the biggest lie, or perhaps the biggest delusion that's ever come out of the academic business community, is the suggestion that opportunities are discovered, whereas in fact opportunities are made.
okay.
If you believe that opportunities are discovered, that they are somehow buried like jewels in the market, then your process becomes about trying to identify where those jewels are and excavate them. In the same way that you might deploy enormous resources to identify where the best oil reserves are, using all sorts of seismic technology and analysis and everything, right?
You know what I think a great example of that is, you know, Matt, is I think about Uber. I mean, you know, I just finished Super Pumped, which was it's a book all about Uber. It's a TV series now. But when you talk about opportunities discovered, I mean, who would have thought about that? Would you put your teenage daughter in a stranger's car to be driven somewhere in a city, as opposed to the fact that, you know, they had to create that themselves and prove that the market existed? Do you agree?
Well, exactly. So the point is that if you believe that opportunities are discovered, you put all of your effort and time and money on analysis, data gathering, and strategizing,
right?
Which doesn't really work.
Right.
Whereas if you believe that opportunities are made, you put all of your effort into relationship building, making something, trying something out, seeing what people think about it, running hypotheses and testing them, experimenting. And that's what entrepreneurs actually do, right? Yeah. So you need to get away from the idea, and this is particularly true of people's wants and needs, that you can analyze your way into certainty about a product's potential. And the kind of irony of the whole thing is that the more people invest in that kind of thing, desk-based research, PowerPoint slides, blah, 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 the more confident they become in their analysis and the greater their risk exposure. You see CEOs and executive boards signing off 8-figure sums for a project that's just purely based on speculation.
Yep.
Whereas if you just say, look, we're just going to try it and see if people like it and then scale up from there, your risk profile is much lower. So yeah, if you want to know what people want, build it and see whether they buy it, but do it in a way where the losses are affordable if they don't.
Another item on your grid here that I want to pivot to, which I thought was really important, and I hope you do agree as well, is this is now the second row on the right, the imitability of a product. A lot of people come up with their ideas of their products or their decisions, and I don't think they think deep enough into how easily that can be copied or done elsewhere. And you tell the story of Meerkat and Periscope and Twitter, and I was hoping you could share that example with our viewers and listeners and how that relates to imitability on the grid.
Wow, well, we really are going back a way now, talking about Periscope and
yeah. I mean, back at Meerkat as well. I remember that. I mean, that just disappeared once Twitter gobbled them up.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the story is a very simple one. That some people launched and made a video social media product that was a product to them, but it was a feature to a much larger, better funded and more powerful rival who already had a massive audience, right? So I guess the parable is the message behind it is don't make a product out of somebody else's feature. Like any more than you should make a torch app for the iPhone.
Let me ask you about imitability though, is it could be a good thing, couldn't it? I mean, if you do have a good idea or a good product and you expect that it's going to be imitated, doesn't imitating the product itself expand the market, maybe even and provide more opportunities for your product? Because it's not as if any one product is ever going to have a complete monopoly on a market. I mean, that's happens, but it's relatively rare. Do you know what I mean? So could it not have benefits if your product is imitated? I'm curious to hear what you think of that.
Well, I think imitability is it's inevitable that you're going to be imitated if you have a successful product that opens up a new market, right? I mean, it's just inevitable.
Well, look at Zoom. Look at Zoom. I mean, Zoom is, they weren't the first video conferencing application to come on the market. Right. I mean, Microsoft had Facebook Live. I mean, there, plenty of WebEx and, you go to webinar, but so the market was out there, but Zoom itself just came up with a better model for getting, their service out. And of course they ran into some good luck with the pandemic.
I mean, Zoom,
but I don't think they could have done that if there wasn't a market already there for them. Like, in other words, getting back to Meerkat, if Meerkat had a better model, maybe better management, they could have said, okay, Twitter with Periscope are going to do their thing, but we can, they've created awareness for this stuff, for online, video, meetings or, whatever. And we can carve out a niche for ourselves. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think imitability is just imitation is a fact of life. And the thing I suppose that interests me most about the elements of the imitability box is probably the concept of competitor lag, which is that given that imitation is inevitable, you just need to keep on trying to to push ahead and keep on forcing. This is one strategy at least. Keep on forcing your rivals into your slipstream. If by the time they've caught up with you, you've already moved on to something new or better or more exciting, then imitability becomes less of a concern. And it's not something that I saw much written about elsewhere when I wrote The Grid. It's the idea that speed is actually a viable strategy for imitability. Most people talk about, kind of intellectual property or legal protection, patents, trademarks, and that kind of thing. But actually, or they talk about durable advantages, which are, well, there aren't actually very many of those, and durable is perhaps not the best word for them, because they're never fully durable, really, unless you're a state-backed monopoly. But yeah, the idea that speed is an alternative to competition would be a good one. And I think you probably see that with, or have historically seen that with I think Tesla would probably be quite a good example of that. Like
that's a great example.
They've just been quicker at bringing new ideas, new features, less risk averse with putting new technology on the market than some of their rivals. But obviously, there's no doubt that the others are
catching up. They're all imitating them.
Well, they're not just imitating them. I think arguably you could say that some of them are doing a better job. The panel gaps on a Porsche Taycan are certainly better than on a Model 3 Tesla, but it's a lot more expensive, isn't it? So
that's a great example, Tesla. And yet Tesla is, their commitment is, I don't think they know they're not going to own the electric vehicle market. So they have, the market share that they're shooting for, and they're going to shoot for that as long as they have a good product to offer. But they could not expand and meet their long-term goals if they weren't imitated, because through this imitation comes government regulation, more power stations, more brand awareness of the efficacy of electric vehicles. It helps Tesla by being imitated. So I guess that was my point. Let me move on as well. I'm sorry, I just have so many questions, and because it's such a great book. On your grid as well, right in the middle, you've got bargaining power, and you talk in your book about the power paradox, the importance of bargaining power for your profitability of your company. Tell us a little bit about what you mean by that.
Oh, sure. Well, the concept is very simple, and this was the kind of. I remember learning Porter's Five Forces at business school, where this was a kind of key element of it. But basically, the basic point is extremely simple. Your business is sandwiched between your suppliers on one hand and your customers on the other hand.
Right.
And whilst you're cooperating, there's also negotiations and bargaining that occurs, right? So customers have more bargaining power if they have more choice, and there's less distinctiveness or differentiation between the products.
Right.
Suppliers have more negotiating power if they're the only person who can supply you the things that you need. And we have more negotiating with our suppliers if we order more. Typically, if we account for 80% of the supplier's revenue, we can effectively dictate the terms to them, right? You also have regulation in there as something that aims to inhibit or, in fact, occasionally increase the bargaining power, of certain people within that arrangement. So bargaining power is an important consideration because some companies have. So, well, why is it an important consideration? It's an important consideration along a couple of different axes, actually. You've got the financial axes, which is what historically people have thought about, and this is what Porter was always kind of crapping on about, is you need to use your bargaining power to increase your profitability. But yeah, kind of, but you also need to acknowledge that trade and business involves social capital as well as financial capital. And occasionally managing, well, not occasionally, in fact, managing relationships with your customers and your suppliers involves deploying and using and conserving that social capital as well.
Yeah.
So needlessly exploiting your suppliers to improve your profits is always going to find its way back to some other element of the grid, and not typically in a very good way.
Yep.
Right? Like they'll cut corners. If you start squeezing them, they'll cut corners and compromise quality, or they'll drag their feet, or they'll find some other way to stick a blade in you. With your customers, if you have punitive contracts with them, it creates this kind of concept of that I wrote about at length in the book of accrued resentment,
Yep.
which eventually boils over and has kind of catastrophic consequences, or certainly can do. And you see that not just in business, but in politics, obviously.
Yep.
So, yeah, my sense about bargaining power is that you need to be aware of it. You need to be aware of the financial implications of it. And a lot of businesses have very savvy procurement strategies because of this. They never give one supplier too much work, because then they're kind of beholden to them. They're very careful about these policies, but what they're less careful about is the social capital aspects of bargaining power, and how they treat their customers and suppliers, and how that affects brand perceptions, and how that affects quality elsewhere. I mean, we've had, let me give you a very, very simple example of this in action.
Sure.
We use a lot of freelancers and associate consultants in our business.
Okay.
And we pay them in full on the day of the invoice. We don't pay them 30 days later or 60 days later, or say we'll pay them 30 days later, but actually pay them 60 days later, or
we do the
not bother
exact
paying
same
them.
thing. We do the exact same thing. Go ahead.
And the reason that we do it is because goodwill and social capital mean a lot in our business, and
That's
they
right.
produce better quality work, and it gives them less to worry about. And it makes them happier, and it makes them say nice things to their friends about our company.
Correct.
And so if you look at the grid, you see like, okay, we have a weaker cash position down in the bottom right-hand side, right? We have not used our bargaining power with suppliers there in the middle, but it creates better awareness in the top right up there. It creates a stronger brand appeal. It creates a better proposition. And also from an imitability point of view, it means that those staff, many of whom are among the best in the world at what they do,
they're not going to leave you.
Are not going to leave us, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at the grid as a whole, it's the right decision. But if you look at the bargaining power box only, it's a bad decision. And this is another great example of systems thinking versus reductionist thinking.
Great example.
If you're some bureaucrat in procurement, you're probably thinking, we could improve our cash position by using our bargaining power here. We should squeeze it.
Yeah.
But they're not looking at the whole. And in fact, we're often on the receiving end of that from those kinds of people at other organizations from time to time. So it's a really good example, actually, of how all the different elements of the grid kind of come together, and how thinking about the broader consequences of things is a much better path to making good decisions.
It's a great example. And, I'm thinking right now, even of I have a client that has got 150 employees. They've got a purchasing manager, and the purchasing manager's one job is to try and, beat the shit out of their suppliers for best prices possible and quickest delivery times. And if that purchasing manager would be considering the impacts of his negotiations decisions over the company as a whole by looking at the grid, I think his job would be a lot different. And, and I think that it's important to take away that your employees need to be making those decisions with the company overall than just how it's impacting your specific little niche in the company. Matt, before we wrap things up, I just have a couple more your questions for you. First of all, so I'm a CPA. I'm interested in the numbers themselves, and right down the middle, you've got your whole profitability column. Obviously, we talked about bargaining power. We haven't talked about revenues. We haven't talked about costs, but you do in the book share some thoughts about cash and cash management, and how it impacts a business over the whole. And I was wondering if you could share with our viewers just some of these thoughts on cash management that they can take away with them when they're considering the impacts of all their decisions on their organization?
Yeah, sure. Well, Gene, I guess one of my great hopes for the grid was that it would provide a means of turning specialists into generalists.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that would apply universally, right? So you're a CPA. Well, I think it's important that if you're in accounting or finance, you have a cursory understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about the importance of brand,
Yep.
when we talk about the importance of customer experience, or when we talk about values and beliefs and that kind of thing, which can be on the softer side.
Agreed.
Likewise, I think it's very important that if you're a designer or a product developer or involved in customer experience or in any of those other things, that you have an awareness of that you're financially literate, basically, that you understand concepts like contribution margin, you understand the distinction between a fixed cost and a variable cost, you understand the distinction between capital expenditure and operating expenditure. Not least of all, because ultimately everyone at a certain point in their level of promotion becomes an accountant, right? Like when you are promoted into the C-suite or the chief executive chair, you are expected to know your way around a balance sheet, cash flow statement, and a P&L. A lot of people, it's their first exposure to them, right? So it's never too early to start building financial literacy. And you also see that, again, a number of crises are caused by people making product decisions without considering the financial implications of them. There was a good book, I think, on the turnaround of Lego, brick by brick, where they were saying that they allow people to go off and create these wild different products. This was, probably in their darkest hour before their amazing turnaround. Right. Of course, the implications of carrying, the working capital implications of carrying all these different parts and things in stock without really knowing whether people were going to buy them were financially kind of catastrophic. So the broader aim was not necessarily to educate people on the merits of cash flow. Yeah, you need enough cash to cover your bills, and thinking about cash flow is extremely important. It was more the broader idea of, are you financially literate? Probably the more important point of it in the grid, and the thing that certainly shocks people the most, is the non-linear impact of price changes on profit. Like when you show people that, let's call it a 2% reduction in price can cause a 20% reduction in profit, because when you discount price, it has a much bigger impact on the amount of profit that each product makes. Most people have never run those calculations.
Sure.
So when they see them, they're like, holy fuck, like look how much money we're throwing away with this mad discounting. Or look how much more money we could make if we just increased our prices by
1%,
3% or 2% or whatever. They just don't think about it, right? So actually the pricing element of the grid has been enormously eye-opening for a lot of people who have literally never given it a second thought. They just pick a price and go with it, and then they never revisit it, and then they never adjust it. So yeah, I mean, I was really hoping that financial literacy would improve as a consequence, and I think that has been a benefit for a lot of readers of the book.
Matt Watkinson is the author of The Grid, the decision-making tool for every business, including yours. Matt is also, besides being an author and a keynote speaker, Matt, you run I apologize, I didn't even mention you run a design agency called Methodical. What does Methodical do?
Yeah, Methodical is the business that I co-founded with my best friend, Ben. We've been working together for 15 years, and almost all of our work is around customer experience in improvements and new product development and strategy and that kind of thing. People come to us for the CX work, but they choose us because we understand the grid. I think we understand we're much more commercially minded or commercially astute or aware of other aspects of a very successful business than a lot of other people in that space. We understand marketing, we understand brand building, we understand finance, we understand business strategy. And so feeling like these CX activities are connected much more tightly coupled to other aspects of what it takes to create a successful business is hugely appealing for them. So yeah, that's what we do. We've got clients all over the world. Well, not all over the world, that's a bit of a stretch. Europe and America,
Different countries,
maybe in Africa, right, or Asia. But certainly Western Europe and across across America. And and people dotted, scattered around all over the place, from Spain to New Zealand. So yeah.
Well, I want to wish you best of success. I also want to thank you for coming on, and talking to me. What you said, you just mentioned earlier that you were working on a new book. Is that something that's imminent?
Well, the book is, it's a bit of a difficult one to answer. The book is written and edited, but we're into the kind of foreign rights discussion for all the different markets and launch schedules. I think it's going to be next year.
Got it. Okay. Well,
I'm excited about it. It's going to be the best of the three.
I'm glad to hear that. We'll definitely have you back to talk on it. So Matt, thank you very much for joining us. Everybody, you've been watching and listening to the most recent episode of BizBooks. My name is Gene Marks. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another conversation with a great author of a great business book. Talk to you then. Take care.